All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to what is already day 3 of the OWASP BeNeLux days. And for the program today, we have 2 talks. The first one is Nicole Becher and Nancy Garichet, who will be talking to us about DevSlop. Ladies, take it away.
Thanks, Cooper. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole, and that is Nancy. It's hard. I guess we're virtual, so I could point down. I think that is Nancy. But yeah, we're happy to be here, and we're going to talk to you about a project called the DevSlop project that has been sort of going on now for about 3 years. A little bit about me. I've been active in the OWASP community for, I don't know, maybe close to a decade now. Yeah, and I have been in the cybersecurity space for around the same time, and I'm happy to be here. Nancy, do you want to introduce yourself or?
Yes, my name is Nancy Garichet. I work in GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance for the government of Canada. I've been involved in OWASP since about 2016, 2017, and a co-project leader since 2018, I believe. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk about our project and how we've grown in the last few years.
Cool. All right, here we go. All right, so what is the DevSlop project? Sorry, I think my cat just strolled past, but so the DevSlop project is an evolving project, right? So it's not just like one thing, it's becoming like maybe more than one thing now. It's more of like an umbrella project. So we're gonna go into a lot of detail as to like, where it's come from and where we think it's headed and how we sort of just plan to be as elastic and, iterative as possible to keep this thing kind of moving in the spirit that we're looking to keep it continuing in. So the history of this project is actually kind of fun. About 7 years ago, I wrote a vulnerable web app called Cyclone Transfers in Ruby on Rails for the Broken Web Applications project that was maintained by Chuck Willis. And so that sort of was like, I decided writing vulnerable web apps was a great way to train people on web security. And it's also kind of fun to write bad code. I recommend that everyone try that a little bit. You learn a lot. And so it became this part of the Broken Web Applications project. So then one day in 2017, it kind of didn't get a lot of attention. After I was done with it, I was sort of like, all right, that's enough of that. And then one day in 2017, I get this very, SOS email from Tanya Janko, who I think a lot of you may know. She's, been part of the OWASP community and the AppSec community for a long time, basically saying, Cyclone's down. I really need it. I'm going to be doing a demo in an hour. And I was like, whoa, people are really using this thing. I didn't realize that. And so I figured out how to get it back up and running. She made her demo and we met. And so then about a month later, we were all in Belfast for AppSec EU in 2017. And we all met, Tanya, Nancy, myself, Christian, who maybe some of you know, Mod Security. We all met in Belfast and we just sort of connected and we were like, wow, there's a lot of stuff we can do here to, engage more in the AppSec space and help others learn, because we were all really into the idea of learning, right? And teaching and learning and teaching and creating an environment like that. So this DevSlop project was born and we sort of came up with this like kitschy name, right? It's like DevOps, but sloppy DevOps, but sort of like trying to kind of get our hands around what this new model is, like DevOps, like what is DevOps or DevSecOps, like all this new tooling, all these new things are coming into play here. And, if you're coming from a client server AppSec background, there's like a reformation that has to happen there in your brain to understand this new model. So we were kind of focused in that area. So then I got back to it again and wrote another vulnerable web app called Pixie, right? And this is a mean stack app that has an API that's intentionally vulnerable. There's a lot of good vulnerabilities in there, which I'll get into in a second. And so that was sort of like how we began the project. We're like, here's another vulnerable web app. Let's do something with it. So then our friend Francisca, who I couldn't be here today, but she works heavily in the mod security space, created a CI pipeline to demonstrate how you can put a WAF in front of a vulnerable web app to actually protect it, right? So it was an automated, deployment tool that allowed you to just get the WAF rules up and running so you can actually protect this application. So we sort of just began to evolve, right? And then in about 2019, Nancy was like, I think we should do a live show. And we were like, all right, that's how this project kind of goes. We're sort of up for anything. And so Nancy took charge and developed this whole live show concept, which we're going to get into in a second, where we basically interview members of the AppSec community or just the security community in general about DevSecOps tooling, ideas, projects they're working on, open source projects, things like that. So we can all kind of learn in this space. So what is Pixie? I guess I could get into this a little bit, right? It's still there. It's on Docker Hub. You can still download the containers and run it. And it's basically a really vulnerable web app that has a lot of problems, right? It's written in Angular 1. So there's a lot of horrible Angular constructor cross-site scripting in there, poorly stored secrets. There's a MongoDB that's misconfigured. There's JWT token problems left and right. You can do CSRF. There's MongoDB injections. There's IDOR issues all over the API. There's really vulnerable dependencies. So it's kind of like a buffet of common AppSec problems that you experience in a mean stack environment. So it's fun. I mean, it's not really, it's not like it's getting a lot of updates, but it still is there and it does work. So if you're interested, you could check it out or you could ping me. Yeah. And then Pixie CRS. So the web app rule, the WAF rule set, right? So again, this was all done by Francisca, and it is a way to automatically test and deploy WAF rules so that you can protect an application like that is already vulnerable, like Pixie. It's very interesting, right? Because it's a different way of thinking about defense. So I was like, I recommend if you're interested in how WAFs work and how you can automate WAF rules, it is a great place to start to understand how that whole model works. And it works really well. I mean, the legitimate traffic doesn't get blocked, but the illegitimate traffic does, and it's all sort of automated. Cool. All right, so what is the DevSlop show?
Yes, so the DevSlop show, a bit like Nicole mentioned in the history of the project, what was missing a bit was the part where Tanya actually started the show, because as she was developer advocate for Microsoft, she was already creating a lot of content and she was interested in AppSec. So she started just experimenting and turning the camera on and going live. But at some point it got overwhelming, right? You travel a lot for your job, you do some OWASP projects, you're volunteering. So she asked me to help her out and try to help her manage the show. And I did. So I really enjoyed that part of researching, because as someone who's in GRC, I don't get to be hands-on that much. But I need to be aware of different technologies. So it was really interesting to me to learn about what was new, but asking other people to come and talk to me about it. And that was a way to learn. So I helped out Tanya. And as you may know, and if you follow Tanya on social media, she started her own training company. So she moved away from the project, but still comes back as the host once in a while, pretty often actually. But yeah. I started to take care of the content. So what it is about is basically inviting InfoSec, DevSecOps practitioner, and to teach us something new. Right. And so it really always starts, my research always starts with the content, with technology. And the inspiration can come from a blog post, from a podcast, from anything interesting that I hear about it, and say, okay, so let's talk about this on the show. That would be interesting to talk and to demo. I wanted it to be different than a podcast. So we were on video. So we always try, it's not mandatory, but we always try to have a demo part on the show to differentiate from a podcast per se. So it's a video show. And the fact that it's DevSlop and it's for sloppy DevOps, it also opened the door to new type of content that was maybe less explored in the OWASP world, right? We're really focused on AppSec, but DevSlop allowed us to go into cloud security, Kubernetes, containers that, yes, we talk, well, we're not the first one to talk about them in OWASP, but, it was a space that was not as explored as other topics. So we really focused on that, but, we're still OWASP. So any topic about security, code reviews, secure coding is also topics that we cover. And then we like to explore topics with diversity, right? So at first it was about, okay, so we have a show next week. Who's available? So we go, ask Tanya, do you have a friend? Ask within my community who wants to be on the show. But then this year, especially, I think 2020, I really decided, let's be consistent, right? Let's put out a show at least twice a month. Weekly was too much, but at least twice a month, and bring somebody on and be consistent with the show. And I started asking myself, who else? Right? Like that's always now the question. Once I have a topic in mind is, yes, sometimes you have that first bit, you think about secure coding and you have that like InfoSec rock star in mind. But the question I ask myself is, who else? Who else is out there? And then I go on a search, a YouTube search, a podcast, anybody who else is talking about that topic and can give us a new perspective. So diversity is really important in the content. And then have fun learning. So deep learning, deep mastery comes after doing some deep work. So we know that won't happen by watching 1 hour of DevSlop show. So we want to make it fun. We want to explore new projects, new topics, deep dive in them, but make it fun, make it entertaining. It's an awareness show and makes you we want to make you curious to want to explore those topics on your own later on. And a sense of community. Why? Well, because people are coming from everywhere around the world. We've had guests from South Africa. We've had from Switzerland, from India, Australia, everywhere around the world. So I think every time we have somebody else that comes from elsewhere around the world, it really grows our community and everybody kind of feels welcome. It feels welcome and says, yeah, this show's for me as well, because I've seen somebody from my community on the show. I think I'm good for the next slide.
Yeah. So I don't know, this is kind of a bragging slide about our stats, right?
Yeah.
As we learn like what works and what, does it, well, I don't know if we learn what works better, right? It's not what doesn't work, what works better, right? There's a lot of optimization on the topics and the guests and how we're going to get, more engagement. And, at this point we have over 40 episodes. We have over 4,000 watch hours, 31,000 views, almost 3,000 subscribers. I mean, it is, I think, Nancy, you were saying that we've qualified for YouTube, some sort of YouTube.
Yeah, monetization. I don't know if we'll turn that on and we'll definitely won't be, driving any luxury cars, but it's still an achievement that we should be proud of, I think, because it means that we have enough followers and people are consistently watching, right? It's more than the subscribers, is knowing that people are watching, whether it's live or after as a replay. They come back to our channel and we have a consistent audience. So that's been really fun to see the growth, right? Like I could see from 100 followers to subscribers to thousands, and then looking at the watch hours every week coming up, and now 4,000 hours. So it's really great.
Yeah. And so, again, as we like sort of keep, pushing and producing the show, it's like we want to really, people spend an hour or 2 or 3 with us, depending on if it's a workshop or a regular episode. We want to make this time as valuable as possible, right? So, people, time is super valuable. So we want to make it, really important, for the audience, right? So some of the episodes that we have, we think are great, right? Like these are technologies that maybe some people have exposure to, but the speed and scale at which these things come out, I think it's very useful to have these kind of like, overview kind of exploratory episodes where you learn at a high level what a tool is, so you can try to figure out whether or not it's for you, right? Like there's just like, sometimes that's really hard to get the answer to, right? So for example, we had an episode, I think it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago now, with Clint Gibler, who runs the TLDR Sec newsletter. He's great, and the newsletter is great. I recommend it to everyone. And he demoed a tool called SemGrep to us, which is basically a static analysis tool that like does it a little bit differently than traditional static analysis tools. And he basically walked us through the entire tool, the end-to-end, how the tool works, how to write rules, and got us off the ground with writing rules in this tool for, in like 15, 20 minutes, right? So there was just a lot of like, we were up and running and had a pretty good understanding of when we would use a tool like this in the hour and 20 minutes that was the episode. So I really recommend that if anyone's interested in like a new model of how to do static analysis, it's not, the traditional static analysis vendors or whatever, this is a really great way to try to, explore what else is out there.
Yeah. And what was fun is that there's a live audience with us when we do the show. So I don't know if you haven't seen the show, it was supposed to be a 60-minute show, but because we had so many questions from the audience, at some point, Clint couldn't go over all of his content. And we asked, do you mind staying with us a bit longer? And that's what ended up being a 2-hour episode, almost like a workshop. So,
yeah.
Yeah, next episode.
And these are just high episodes. We're trying to convince people that like good stuff is happening here. That's what we're trying to do right now. We're not going to walk you through every single episode. That would be so boring. We just want to show you at a high level, we actually are doing cool things and we're learning cool things on this show. So that's sort of what we're gonna talk about.
Yes, I wanted to mention this episode because Farah, how I found because of the YouTube algorithm. So basically it just ended up in front of me, and she was doing bug bounty. I think she only had 3 videos. And at some point she came out with a video about JSON Web Token hacking. And I thought, oh, that could be compatible with our show. And she blew up, and she's part of the community of the bug bounty community, right? So it's not necessarily the same as OWASP. It's more of a defensive security more than defensive security. But it's interesting to bring that community to us and then use that time as well to show them how to defend themselves against those attacks. So we had the main guest was Farah Hawa, but we also invited Rana Khalil, who's also a web app specialist who was able to provide advice on how to protect on the attacks that Farah was explaining. And inviting people from the offensive side to show us, okay, what can be done, and to inform the defensive side how to protect their application and their systems. So that was a fun show for that.
Yeah, this was another great show. I mean, they all were kind of great, but Checkoff is a open source tool written by Bridge Crew, and it is a pre-flight checking tool for infrastructure as code. So if you have CloudFormation or Terraform scripts that are about to, or Kubernetes that you're about, YAML files that you're about to hit the button on and launch infrastructure with, Checkoff is a great tool that allows you to check all of those scripts for compliance or other sort of best practices so that bad stuff doesn't go out the door. And there's a lot to this tool, and there's a lot of rules that that have been written by the Bridge Crew team. But it is open source. It's free. Anybody could download it and deploy this. And tools like this we feel like are interesting to highlight because it's sort of a newer model of security, right? Pre-flight checks of infrastructure as code. I mean, I think that's kind of newer. At least it's not more than 2 or 3 years old. I don't know, I could be wrong. But again, that's the goal here, is to show you a new way of doing things, right? And open source projects that are committed to being open source and to providing resources for this new model.
Yeah. And we're used to having static analysis to talk about static analysis tool for regular like software development. So what has been also talking about DevOps and DevSecOps is seeing all these infrastructure as code or everything as code coming up, and seeing how we can use practices that we've been using in software engineering and applying them to infrastructure and Terraform and CloudFormation and things like that. I find that our audience is very curious about that. Anything that's for infrastructure as code or policy as code, security as code, those are definitely topics of interest. Yes, API security. Our most popular episode, I think it has 10,000 views, is from a lady called Katie Paxton-Fear. She's from the UK, and she did a show on hacking APIs, and that was very popular. She had a huge following, and we have really good feedback about that show. But I really wanted to mention that one with the one that Rajni Hatti mentioned that we did a couple months later, because I said that the slop earlier was about community and about talking about who else could be talking about different topics that we're used to. I met Rajni Hatti at a Women Tech Maker conference in Montreal, and she had a presentation on API testing. And realized that she had not, basically the focus of her presentation was not security at all. And we talked a bit after her presentation, and Nicole had her vulnerable app and some content. I think you did a lightning talk in Switzerland as well about API security, and I gave her that information. And then a few months later, I think even a year later, API security top 10 came up, and I send that to her and say, hey, I'd love you. I know that you're a tester. I know you do API testing. Here's the API top 10. And could you come in the show in a couple months? Because we do book our shows months in advance, in a couple of months, and see, what can you do? How can this be applicable to you as a tester? How could this guidance that is provided by OWASP help you change the way you work? And then she came up with this presentation and how she used the API top 10 and adapted her work to that. So I really love that show because of that story at the background and how we can bring people, talk about the same topic from different perspectives. So we had the hacker with Katie, and we have the security, the tester, just API tester, just for quality, I guess. And not focus on security, but using OWASP guidance to change her practices. So, yeah.
OPA. So OPA, I think we all know maybe what that is. It's Open Policy Agent, and it's a very popular policy as code kind of tool that was just recently admitted to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Yeah, CNCF.
Yeah.
And we had an episode with Josh Stella, who showed us how OPA or how OPA can be used in a variety of different environments. And there, he has a tool called Fugue or Rigo, that is an open source tool that sort of abstracts away some of the Rigo that you need to write with OPA to make it a little bit easier to write Rigo rules, which is actually really great. If anyone has ever written Rigo rules, I think you'll realize it's not traditional programming, at least in my opinion. You have to learn its way, and it can be very confusing. And this open source tool kind of makes that a lot easier. So again, this allows you to create policy as code rules in your organizations, with ease, that you could then deploy to do all sorts of infrastructure as code checks, Kubernetes checks, whatever YAML file you have, you can run OPA against it to validate that YAML is compliant, secure, whatever it is, whatever controls you're looking to validate against, you can do that with a tool like this. So it was great. I mean, you just learned so much about how to optimize the use of these tools, not even just what they're used for, but how you can actually go from 0 to 10 very trivially with just knowing where these tools exist and that they exist and what they're used for. All right.
Yeah, I want to
So-
use this slide maybe to talk about what's coming up and the community. Go ahead, Nicole.
No, yeah, have at it, Nancy.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So that's basically what we do. Having the shows, we take feedback from the community basically to know where we want to go next. Because it's a pandemic, we're virtual, so the shows is a really good format that we want to continue. But there's been a demand for more content, for more training, for more workshop. We've invited different members of the community. There's a lot of content out there, and we have a platform that can be used. We don't have to reinvent the content, but just format it, make it accessible to everyone. So. Yeah, look out for more content from us, from other people from the community. Would it be workshop? We have, I'm very excited personally about CTF, a DevOps CTF, where it's more of a builder challenge. We have a lot of people signed up already.
And when is that?
That's
next
December 6th. Right?
Okay.
December 6th. And we build challenges, and you get flags for building things instead of breaking them. And you get points. And we just signed up a Cloud Guru as a sponsor to give prizes for the top teams. So that's going to be really exciting and a learning experience, but we gamified it by giving it the CTF format. So that's one example of something that we use the community for, the platform that we have to create new sorts of content.
And if you're interested in going or signing up, you can go to our meetup page, in which that's sort of how the workflow goes. All new episodes or new shows, workshops, whatever, come through the meetup page, and then we live stream them on YouTube. That's right, Nancy. That's our
yes. I try to always send people to the meetup page because that that's the start of a relationship, in the sense that you can know what's coming up every time we have a new guest booked. I try to publish it there so you can plan, you can know what's coming up. Our YouTube is more of where we store our shows and where it happens, but where we have all the information, or the almost replacement for a website, as the meetup community. So to know what's coming up, I think that's the best way to start. But of course, to put the word out about everything, we are on pretty much all social media platform like Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram, where you see our posts that we try to brand very particularly for DevSlop, so they're recognizable, and I always get really nice comments about them saying, "Oh, I'm always waiting for the next show and see who's coming up next." So we try to make it exciting and be as professional as possible.
Yeah, and we think there's a gap in this area, right? We think it's a little bit harder for people to, find environments and communities in which they could just learn something, learn a new tool, learn a new model in the AppSec space. So we're deeply committed to sort of filling that gap with this content, right? I just think that's like, I don't know. I've looked around. We haven't found anything that's quite like this. So we're very excited about like what we're doing here. And again, we're coming from like, we were writing vulnerable web apps to this. So like, I don't know, a year from now, who knows what this will be, but that's sort of the ride we're on, right, Nancy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess something I did mention on the slide that I want to mention is we don't see Francisca that much on the show because of time zones and family and other issues, but she's in the lab, right? She's working on testing different pipeline, and she actually has a series of blog posts on dev.to, explaining her project and experimenting with different cloud platforms. So yeah, depending on our interest, depending on the demand, we really create different type of content that can be appealing in the community, to the community.
Cool. Yeah.
That's what
I think we are. Yeah, that's our pitch here. Come follow us, come join our shows. If you like them, tell us. If you think we could do something better, tell us that too. We're very open. We just are happy to kind of share this type of model with you all. So thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, then I have one tiny question. Say somebody has something that they think is a good topic for you to discuss, how should they best communicate that to you? How would you prefer them to communicate that to you? Or do you prefer to do this on your own?
Oh no.
No, I think we're very open. Yeah.
Yes. Our DMs are open on all the platform. We're actually really accessible on Twitter, everywhere. You just send a message, and and we're open to anybody that wants to come speak. Of course, like I was saying during the presentation, we're booked. I think I was so scared because early on when we were doing the shows every week, I was like, oh, what are we going to do next week? So I just started preparing the shows months and months in advance. I think we have guests until March or April 2021 booked. And it's really hard to just put somebody in the schedule. We like to have some weeks off. But yeah, we're always hoping to have different people that have content that would be interesting to our audience. So yeah, I hope it shows that we're doing it for the community, that's something that represents you, and that is for you. Therefore, you're welcome. And we don't always invite the top expert in the field or whoever wrote the book on the topic. What you'll see coming up is Kiki Morgan, for example, that I started a relationship with just because she was in a Slack channel and she kept asking questions about things about AWS and permissions and serverless. And I would see her coming back week after week for question and building her thing. And I reached out to her and say, what are you building? You should come in this show and tell us about it. And she'll be coming next week, actually on Sunday. To talk. On Sunday to talk about that. So really it's about like meeting new people, knowing their project and bring it to everybody else and see what's possible.
Okay, awesome. Then I'm going to say thank you ever so much for your explanation of DevSlop. And people, by all means, as I said, go have a look and give their project their content a view. It sounds like there's something there quite literally for everybody. We're going to do a quick break now, and then we'll be back in anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes with Grant Ongers, who is going to talk to us about threat modeling with OWASP Cornucopia. So don't go anywhere. Thank you for doing this. This was awesome. So I think now is as good a time as any to explain to people who were expecting Jeff Foley to be up next. Jeff wanted a little bit more time than half an hour to explain OWASP en masse. So he is giving his talk tomorrow. That will start, I believe, at 8:15 Dutch local time. Yeah, that's going to be pretty cool. But as a result, Grant's talk is going to be the next one and will be the last talk of today. Hopefully he will join me in a couple of minutes and then we shall go live with him.
Wow.
All right, and we are back, and at this time we have for you the one, the only Grant Ongers, who is going to be talking to us about threat modeling using cornucopia. Grant, take it away. It would seem that we're not getting Grant's audio through to the rig, even though I am hearing it fine. Let me quickly remedy that for a moment. Just a tick, please. How can I change that? How the hell does that happen? Output, playback, Firefox to, yes, there it is. And we have Grant. I think he should now be audible. Grant, can you say something, please? That does not really. Want to? I'm still struggling, so how does that happen? I've got Firefox who is sending to everything. Oh dear God, it's either that one or it is that one. Can I get a 1, 2, please?
Test 1, 2.
That is perfect.
1, 2.
So we are heading straight to here and there. And I am going to say, Grant, we've got it all lined up now. Take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Cooper. Hopefully you guys can hear me now. And good evening if you're watching this live. And if you're watching this in the playback, good whatever time of day it happens to be there now. As Cooper mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the gamification of threat modeling using OWASP Cornucopia. Now, yesterday, Brooke Schoenfield did a talk titled Great Threat Modeling Experience. And then he was joined by Azar for a talk on Agile Threat Modeling with Sebastian Delena-Snyder, who was sort of overseeing that. These are all incredible folks in the threat modeling world and whose work you should definitely go catch up on. If you haven't watched it live yesterday, do yourself a favor and go watch the YouTube afterwards. Today, I'll be taking you down a parallel path using one of the OWASP projects I'm very keen on, which is Cornucopia. So firstly, who am I? Well, just 3 takeaways from a very busy slide. I apologize for that. The first thing is I'm really, really into this community. I'm fortunate enough to have been elected to represent the OWASP community globally on the board. I've been a DEF CON goon for over a decade now, been involved with Black Hat for nearly as long, usually on the other side of the camera though. How to contact me? There's my email addresses, Grant at Secure Delivery, if you want to ask a commercial question. Otherwise, if it's to do with the foundation, which I hope most of your queries will be, please reach out to me at the OWASP.org email address there. And of course, Twitter or wherever else, pretty much everywhere else, I'm at REWTD, Root Demon. And then the last thing you can take away from this very busy slide is that I've done this for a long time and seen a lot of the iterations of how we do things as we move through. So hopefully I can bring some of that to this talk today. Just briefly on the commercial side, my company, Secure Delivery, I'm one of the founders. We're an AppSec-focused company. It's our mission to try and meaningfully improve application security practices throughout the industry. We've been trusted to deliver assessments, guidance, and training for some of the biggest and most innovative companies out there. And there's a couple of shout outs to those companies down at the bottom there. On the foundation side, this deck, obviously I use quite a lot to talk to, or the basis of this deck I use a lot to talk to other groups. Hopefully you know all about OWASP, but if you don't, we are both a project organization and communities, and there's tons of projects, 150 projects, or more than 150 projects, open source that include the top 10s. Yes, there's more than one. And include some of the greatest tools that I've ever used, like OWASP SAP and SAM and ASVS, which we use all the time. We're also a community organization, which means that there's a chapter in many tech cities. There's probably one near you, and if there isn't, it's probably time for you to reach out and start one. We also have conferences like this one, both online and in person, back in the days when those things were permissible. So keep an eye out for conferences happening nearby. What do I mean by threat modeling? I'm gonna dive in and just this is a quick overview slide of what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about what threat modeling is very briefly, just so that everyone has context. We're going to talk about what that looks like at pace, and by pace I mean the delivery speed of the organization. We're going to talk about Cornucopia, exactly what that is, where the name comes from a little, and then we'll do some practical stuff, some hands-on things. So whenever somebody says threat modeling, I can't not hear Adam Shostak's voice in my head going through spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. And he does that so fast because he says it all the time. Stride is probably the go-to method for most organizations that are doing threat modeling. It's 21 years old this year. It's still very well used. Adam actually did a write on its 20th year last year in dark reading. I'll probably have a link for that at the end for you. But basically, Stride is about spoofing, which is pretending to be something that you're not, tampering, which is altering data in some way, like giving yourself more in-game money or whatever it is you're doing. Repudiation is proving who did what. Information disclosure is about exfiltrating data. Denial of service is preventing normal usage. And elevation of privilege is really sort of the crown jewel. That's what all attacks are trying to achieve, gaining access, more access than what they should have. Threat modeling, like Stride, happens in a very waterfall-y type way, generally. Waterfall environments are all using Stride, and you can do Stride in Agile, but we used to do Stride predominantly when we were doing waterfall, which is a very linear process, right? You got requirements and blah, 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 all the way through to deployment. You get one shot, and really only one shot, right here, to really discover threats before you've spent time and money building things. And this is the point at which you can actually prevent something from happening before it ends up in prod. If you miss something, it ends up in production, and it either iterates through or you're patching something in a place you don't want to be. Now, in the Agile world, which is always this little figure of 8, we only really get a chance to change things like we did in the waterfall method over here, right? This is the point at which time during planning and as you move into coding, that's when you can actually make decisions about potential threats and how to mitigate against them. But this loop is a small release, and we get to refine each time we go through it with input that we gather from like here or here, and well, actually here, everywhere. So with an Agile world, we get to do threat modeling a lot more frequently. Now, talking about frequently, threat modeling is all about time. Literally, we do it at design time. So we design for security in the design phases of our iterations, but it takes time to do. The larger the functionality that we're looking at to try and threat model, the more time it's going to take. And as our products evolve, so must our security understanding also evolve, which means that it changes over time. I believe this leads to a couple of issues. So firstly, when do we get security? So as a security guy, if I'm acting as a security individual on the security team, when do I get my hands on the designs that developers have for products they're going to produce? Is it before they started writing code? Not usually. And if it is, then I become this blocking phase before they can start. So I'm holding up delivery. Pretty much always that's going to happen. Threat modeling. The sooner the better, but never too late. My very good friends, Stephen and Avi of the OWASP Threat Modeling Project, on when threat modeling should ideally happen. Because this doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't know, right? Do it soon, as soon as you can. Just don't make sure it's not too late. And that's true. The second problem it comes up with is it takes too much time. So how much time is enough time to have invested in this process, in the threat modeling activities? Well, this quote comes from Adam Shostak's blog on magical approaches to threat modeling. And in it, Adam asks for a fourth option to the 3 magical approaches that he describes. And that fourth option is going to result in not too many threats. So hopefully we can come up with some ideas of how we can get to an answer for this, right? So a fourth approach to doing threat modeling that don't cover it. The question I have is, though, when do we stop looking for additional threats? The last one is inaccurate models. So are our threat models going to be good enough, right? They change over time. When do we have a good enough threat model, and is it going to be good enough? For that, I've got a couple of quotes. First one is from George Box, who says that all models are wrong, but some models are useful. He goes on to say that the question is the model good enough for this particular application? So the answer, I think, is in that quote. We need to make sure that our threat model is good enough for what we're trying to achieve. So a good enough model is what we want to have. And we need to build that model using whatever time we can afford. And we need to do it as early as possible in the process as we can. So given this, I like to do the earliest possible in the story scrubbing or backlog grooming or whatever phrase you want to use to describe it. Now, Mike Cohn coined the phrase backlog grooming in 2005. Call it whatever you want, but it's before stories are added to a sprint to be worked on. It's where you get to define the acceptance criteria. Which brings me to my second step. It's time boxed. Backlog grooming or story scrubbing is a time boxed activity. So it happens anyway. It's limited in duration. We only spend so much time doing the grooming. And we already expect to have non-functional requirement outcomes from that process. So it fits perfectly at that point. We also stop when we can build the thing that we need to. So when we have enough data, enough information to fulfill the acceptance criteria, remember, we can iterate. We can go back on it. We can do more of it later. So talking about Cornucopia. So Cornucopia is a game built on a number of really well thought through projects. They've leveraged things like the ASVS, the SCP, and App Sensor from OWASP. They've also pulled in things like Safecode and MITRE's Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification. So the basis for Cornucopia is some really good, solid thinking that's happening both within the foundation and with entities outside of it. Now, I am not as heavily involved in Cornucopia, the project, as I probably should be, or as I will probably end up being. Colin and I have talked about the next iterations of Cornucopia and what that might entail. For example, we already need to start looking at what we're going to do with the new versions of ASVS to make sure that we tie Cornucopia into that. These projects being the basis of Cornucopia mean that Cornucopia does have to evolve, and it will evolve as those projects gain more knowledge and become better at what they're doing. So what do you need to do in order to start doing some threat modeling? Well, perfect world, I'll have a architectural design of what it is we're going to build, and I'll have some data flow diagrams. That perfect world is almost never, in my experience, the actual perfect world, because we'll have something that represents the design as it was envisioned before it was sold as being something we're going to go build. And we'll have some rough understanding of data flow in that design. And those two documents will probably fairly closely overlap and fairly closely correlate with each other. But don't get hung up on having them or on having them accurate, because the reality is what you really need in order to do threat modeling is you need some time to play, because it is a game and you're going to need the time for it. You're going to need as many folks who are involved in building or testing the features that you're going to be looking to threat model as you can possibly get your hands on and put into a room together or into a virtual session together. And you need a will to actually get stuck into it, because it's going to take a bit of time and effort, and the outcomes are going to result in more work. So you're going to be doing work that's going to produce more work for you. So as long as you have those three things, time to play it, the folks that are involved in building or testing, and a will to actually make threat modeling happen, it will happen. Tomorrow evening, I'm actually doing a threat modeling masterclass with a company called Agile Stationery, who are trying to help deal with threat modeling using these gamifications in a smarter way now that we're all distributed. So I'm very curious to see how that masterclass goes, and definitely I'll be updating slide decks for the future with that. And feel free to ping me on Twitter to find out how it went, and I'll be sure to let you know. So outputs of some traditional threat modeling exercises. Well, this is a good threat modeling template. This traditional threat modeling template gets you a rigorous model with some possible threats. It gets you some great insights into the diagram state of the application, so the application as it was drawn up or as you were looking at it before. And it gives you a fairly good understanding, an improved understanding of the data flow as we anticipate it to be. Now, all of this is happening in design, and it's happening up front. It doesn't really give us the data flow as it is happening. It doesn't really give us the actual state of the application as it runs. It'll give us the diagram state, and it'll give us some anticipated data flows. This template, as I said, is a good one. It comes straight out of the OWASP Threat Modeling Cookbook, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. Again, there'll be some links at the end for you. Agile threat modeling, though, the image that I have there on the right-hand side of the slide is actually the score sheet, the scorecard for Cornucopia. With agile threat modeling, what we actually want to do, we're going to use the score sheet because we're going to, I mean, it's a game, we have to have winners, so we're going to have to keep score. But what we're writing down in those lines that are under each of those colored bars are going to be stories that'll have some acceptance criteria because security is a non-functional requirement, remember. And we'll have those stories that we will either be able to put directly into the backlog as these are items that need to be done, or these will be things that we need to add to existing stories before we start work on them. So they will be the NFRs of those stories. We'll get some context around some functionality in the code for security. So everybody who's going to be working on the code will now have some understanding of what the impact this piece of code is going to have from a security point of view, and also an idea of what they need to look out for as they're building it. As a completer side, we'll probably end up with much more accurate data flow diagrams and much more accurate diagram states of how the application is going to be built through the process. Because as people start talking about things, you'll see that they will update the slides, they'll update the drawings that we now have on that virtual whiteboard or the physical whiteboard in the room. So the real outcomes from proper threat modeling is, well, let's start off with threat modeling can get really academic. And it can't be academic. It shouldn't just be purely a theoretical thing. It needs to change the system to be useful. So we need to make sure that we identify the issues, that those issues get onto the backlog, and then we need to get product owner sponsorship for the stuff that we think is important so that it actually gets fixed. So how do we go about doing that? Well, cornucopia. We use a deck of cards. So let's take a look at those cards. And in fact, I have a bunch of them here, different versions of the cards. In fact, there's a version from Blackfoot who did the first deck of cards that you could actually go online, just ask for a copy of it. And I mentioned that they are stationary earlier. They've got a nice giant size deck of cards, which is kind of nice because it's about the same size as the elevation of privilege decks. But in the deck of cards, there are a number of suites. And we're going to take a look at them. The first suite is the one I've got up here. It's authentication. And authentication is, of course, all about who you are. So identity is the key component here in authentication. And this maps really well to the spoofing and repudiation aspect of Stride. So Cornucopia does also have a way to map back to the traditional threat modeling that you might be used to doing, or that your security team might expect you to be doing. So anything authentication related is going to be mapped back to spoofing and repudiation aspects within Stride. Authorization, the second deck in the deck of cards, is all about what you can do. And this kind of maps back to Stride's elevation of privilege. But authorization is a mapping of roles or user characteristics that tie into features or aspects of data that you're allowed to touch. So authorization, another key aspect. Anytime you're talking about can a user do something, should a user be allowed to do something, you're talking about authorization, and you need to bear in mind what that authorization model needs to look like. Session management is the next suite, and session management is often how we map the who you are and what you're allowed to do over a period of time. Generally, we're talking about web applications. Generally, there's some kind of session, some kind of way that you don't have to keep logging in for every action you try to take. And all of the mechanisms behind making that work is included in session management. Session management generally deals with, from a Stride point of view, possible denial of service attacks. So it's to stop people from knocking you out of the system while you're currently logged in doing something, to make sure that you have access for a period of time, depending on the type of activities that you're trying to take. Data validation and encoding helps deal with tampering to some degree. It is also a key aspect of almost everything on the top 10. Whenever we talk about the top 10 and how that maps back to activities that developers should be concerned with, data validation is about not trusting user input, and encoding is about ensuring that anything that you're going to be outputting to another system is safe for that other system to consume. Generally, you want to be very aware of concepts like threat boundaries or trust zones, when you're looking at data validation and coding. Anything that crosses a trust boundary, that's something that should be either validated because it's coming in or encoded because we're putting it out. Cryptography, which kind of helps combat information disclosure. And cryptography is all about the secrets. So whether that's the securing data in transit between the user and the web service, or between the web service and a backend service of some kind, or between the backend services and some database components, or whether that's about storage in the database, or whether that's about how we put things into cookies. Cryptography is all about making sure that secrets remain secret. I kind of like to think of these as the OWASP top 5, which aren't really a thing, but they kind of cover the top 5 important things, the top 5 areas that you need to be focused on, need to be aware of when dealing with any application that you're building. But what about that last suite in the bottom right there? Well, that's cornucopia, which is the Trump suite. And the Trump suite aims to cover a bunch of things, all of the things that possibly aren't covered anywhere else. So cornucopia's Trump suite in the game itself will also act as a way of elevating to still win a round, even though you possibly don't have the right cards for that round. You can still get around it with this Trump suite. It also adds a lot more gamification to how we play. So how do you actually play the game? Well, there are 9 steps, broadly speaking. And it starts with filtering the deck because we may not want to cover all of the cards. There's a large number of cards. There's ace through 10, jack, queen, king. So 13 cards in each suit, 6 suits. So there's 60 cards across the board. Maybe more. Math's not. It's too late for math. So we might want to pre-sort the deck, take some cards out and ensure that we're only, because the thing that we're working on doesn't have any user inputs, so we're not going to worry about data validation. There's no authentication happening here because that's in a separate module that we know is taken care of. So we're not going to deal with authentication. We know the users are properly authenticated. When you filter out cards, just be aware that you are filtering them out. So you're limiting what you might possibly see as a threat somewhere in the system. So just be aware that you are doing that. We do it though because of time. A game can take a long time depending on how much discussion is had between each card. You deal out the deck, make sure everybody gets the cards they want. You want to take whatever's left of the deck, whatever is being discussed, and distribute that as equally as you can amongst everyone who's playing. Then you need to play. And you'll look at an app, somebody who gets to go first, and there's a really cool Chiwazi little phone app that you can download and use that will help you to pick who gets to go first. Or alternatively, you can pick, I don't know, the person with the longest beard in the room gets to go first. I generally tend to win that. Or you can pick some other random reason. The youngest person in the room, the oldest person in the room, the person who's been on the project the longest or the shortest. That person will look at the app, select a card from their hand, and then play it. And the playing of that card is step 4. At that point, you will describe what you think the attack is. So you'll read what's on the card and you'll say, I think this applies to our application because if I did this or that, wouldn't I be able to somehow cause this outcome? And it's literally just about using the tools that Cornucopia provides. So on each card, there is a list of the various ASVS or other projects that Cornucopia calls out to. And using all those details and the information that's on the card, you can then talk through a potential attack scenario. The reason you're talking through that attack scenario is because, and this is crucial, you have to convince the rest of the players that your attack is a valid attack, that what you're saying is feasible. Or at the very least, they can't rule out that it's impossible. And if you manage to get away with it's not impossible, then the item that's going on the backlog is verify that the thing that Grant came up with can't actually happen. And it's still a backlog story item, and it still scores you points. You score, yes or no. Everybody goes through that same process. Step 7 is about following suit, which means that whatever card was played by the first player, the next person has to play a card that matches that. It's as simple as that. At the end of the day, at the end of the game, when everybody's played and you've gone through all the rounds and you've used all your cards, or you've run out of time and you've decided, because you're time boxing it, you decide that that's the end of it. At that point, you need to award the prize. And there should be a prize. There should be something. Maybe it's you get to wear a crown for the day, or the product owner buys you lunch, or I don't know. It depends entirely on your team. Maybe you're exempt from having to deal with build breakages for a week if you win the game of Cornucopia. There should be some reward for having won, because otherwise there's no competition. And remember, it's important that you're allowed to cheat, because it's a game. And hackers are not going to be very gentle with your system. They're going to cheat. They're going to find sneaky ways of getting in. So you need to start thinking sneakily as you're playing. And that's an important aspect of the game, right? Just don't get caught cheating. And then the last step, number 9, is to follow up. Those items we've added to the scorecards need to end up on a backlog somewhere. They need to get put into Jira. They need to become tickets. We need to do something with them. And then we need to make sure that they've been tagged as having belonged to a threat modeling session. And possibly, even if you're doing it from a compliance point of view, you might want to tag which threat modeling session it was specifically associated with. So that's all tied up neatly and nicely. There's a video explaining that.
The suits are broken down just like regular cards, 2 through ace. On each card is an attack. The lower the card, the easier the attack is to defend. The higher the card, the harder the defense. And just like in poker, aces are high. But here, that means you get to devise a new attack for that suit.
So that very short piece of a 15-minute video, the whole video end to end is 15 minutes. It'll take you through the whole game. It'll give you a bunch of examples. And this was very, very, very kindly put together by a company that I'll talk about a little bit later, who's done a fair amount of threat modeling with me. And they've done a really good job at making this something that they can get out to all the developers. And you can obviously see what I was doing during lockdown, and it sure as hell wasn't getting anywhere near my razor, or barber for that matter. So the company that actually put together that is a company called RBI, and that's Read Business Information. They're a division of RELX, so they're a fairly large company, one of the large companies that you've never heard of, or probably have never heard of. But they have about 1,500 developers to that 15,000 employees, about 1 in 10. And that's too many people for me to be able to go out and actually have a session with and train. And the important thing about Cornucopia is that it isn't a game that security plays with developers. It's a game that developers play. Now, they do need to learn how to play it. And that video that you saw was one of the things that RBI did in order to get the knowledge out there in the world. The other thing that I did was I put together a series of white papers actually started off as being an email, ironically, an email to one of the Scrum Masters who was arranging a training session in the Netherlands. I was in Amsterdam at the time, and unfortunately, I didn't realize that the team was all distributed. So I'd come across from the UK, but the team was all over Europe. So we weren't going to be able to sit in a room anyway. So I wanted to put together a sort of a how-to for her to actually run the session. And when she printed it out and bound it and handed it back to me, I realized it was actually almost a book. So at some point, I might actually just publish that as a bound work or as a PDF that you can grab hold of. But it's important that you get the knowledge out into the developer world about how to actually put together a game, how to run a game, how to play the game, and have developers do it. 1,500 developers, too many people for me to try and train. RBI has some really hard problems to solve. Most of their problems are data related. Portions of their business provide transaction filterings to most of the world's top 10 banks, so it's high volume, highly data driven, very sensitive data generally. And they come from a world, they're born out of a world where they were a lot of smaller businesses to start with. So they're used to working very insulated, very agilely, very, very quick. But at the same time, they need to take into account that they are a large organization, and the data they're gathering ends up being gathered into these large data stores. And something happening in app 1 could possibly have an impact on data that is completely unrelated or somewhere else. So they don't want to lose their agility, but at the same time, they do need to do something about security. And this worked really well for them. So why do we do this? So the key outputs, the advantages. Why do I use Cornucopia? Well, it's close. it's close to where it's happening, close to devs are doing it. So traditional threat modeling tends to happen at an elevated pace in security teams without devs being involved, or possibly with devs being involved, but maybe after they've already done the implementations, or without the context for developers as to why security is asking all these questions. It's smart. It's incredibly educational. It allows the security team to provide all the knowledge that they might need to give to developers without having to have them sit down and go through a PowerPoint presentation, the checkbox at the end. It's effective. Things actually get seen and fixed. Combining the competitive nature that developers generally have and the practical and developer-aligned view on areas of concern that Cornucopia brings to it, and how it's a part of your story scrubbing process, it's a very effective tool. It does exactly what you would expect it to. I've got there addictive, and possibly addictive is not the right word, but it does become natural. It becomes something that developers just automatically seem to do. And eventually get to the point where those scrubbing sessions only happen at the epic level rather than a story level, because devs, as they start working on stories, will automatically start to add little bracket TM bracket acceptance criteria to stories before they start working on them. So, or as part of what QA is doing with the story, they'll be adding the little bracket TM bracket threat modeling tag to acceptance criteria that they're adding to a story, and then QA will obviously pick that up and look at it as part of their quality assurance. It works really well. Cornucopia, well, the whole quote is threat modeling with Cornucopia empowers engineers to expand their application security knowledge through thought-provoking challenges, which in turn allow them to move fast, more securely. This quote is by Jeff Jenkins, who's the CISO at Reed Business. Jeff has one of the hardest jobs. Being the CISO of an organization that has as much data in its hands as RBI does is difficult. And allowing developers to deal with threat modeling on their own terms took a fair amount of faith. But it's worked for them. It's worked really well for them. So how do we make it work? The first step is use the decks. Don't just deal down through the decks. We actually had a team try and do that. It doesn't work. You have to play the game. If there's no gamification happening, there's no challenges happening to what you say the threat might be, then there's no further thought. And quite often, you'll find that the threat that you put down isn't necessarily the threat that ends up going on the backlog, because you'll find, wait, there's actually a bigger problem. There's a whole area that we need to look at that's far more interesting. Change up the game. Not all features need to be modeled. Perhaps you can avoid modeling some of the features. As I said earlier, with RBI, we started moving to a point where it wasn't just every story that we did. It was at a higher level, only looking at some epics. Use the systems available. We're all communicating. Even now, remotely, we're communicating as a team. So use those. There's a link there for Agile Stationery, who are some awesome people. They will send you decks of cards if you want to send them. If you can't get them printed up yourself. If you do use a deck of cards, there's a 20% discount rate for OWASP members, and there's a 30% discount rate if you buy in bulk. So you can get them through OWASP. You can actually go straight to the OWASP website, download the print templates for the cards, and print them out yourself. But if you can't be bothered to go through that, you can actually just either speak to somebody in your chapter and get them to get some decks sent out to the chapter, or go reach out to Agile Stationery and get your boss to buy you a bunch of decks. They're not that expensive. Agile Stationery also have, this is why I keep tagging them, they also have an open source tool that they use called the Croupier, which the hardest part of dealing with actual cards in your hands when you're doing a remote session is, how do you know who gets which cards? And with the Croupier, you just go plug in a bunch of names. You can just plug in name A, B, C, D, E, F, G, however many people you have, and it'll automatically create an output that the Scrum Master who's doing that can then send off to each individual player. Then you, as the individual player, take your deck of cards, you take out the cards that you've been issued for the game session you're going to be playing, and then you have those cards in your hand. And it works really well, because otherwise we've got to try and figure out in-game how to get people cards dealt. And there are also a number of approaches we've taken to doing some digital versions of the game, which have been largely problematic because, well, everything on a screen is hard. Having pieces of paper in your hand that you can shuffle back and forth through seems to work really well. Although I'm still holding out hope that I'll get a mobile version where you can use your mobile phone. So the same concept, the group here will deal out cards and send it to your individuals who signed in with their mobiles to a particular app. But of course, all becomes complicated and there's a lot to go with that. If you have thoughts on doing some digital stuff, please reach out to me. I'd be really, really keen to collaborate with you on that. It would be quite cool. That is everything I have for you. These are my details again. If you want to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. There's my email address, grantolongas@owas.org, or REWTD on Twitter or LinkedIn or pretty much everywhere else. And I know I was supposed to leave this slide up as last that you guys can have, but I do need to show you this slide. I mentioned Adam's 20 years of stride article. I mentioned the RBI walkthrough video. I'm sure that the slide deck will be made available to you as well. So hopefully you can go and grab the links from here. Yeah, that's me. So there's the OWASP code for the 20% discount, by the way.
Okay,
Assuming
cool.
that everybody watching this is OWASP.
All right. Thank you, Grant. We do, in fact, have a question.
Ooh, excellent.
We've got Veronica Schmidt who's wanting to know, how can this be applied in a waterfall environment and will it translate?
It can definitely translate. You would do it in a waterfall environment. You do it the same way as you would do any other form of threat modeling. So at the beginning, when you're doing the design phase, you'd go through, when you're doing the design aspect of waterfall, you'd go through the threat modeling exercise. The problem with that is that you're going to end up using a lot of time because you're modeling, usually in a waterfall environment, you're modeling fairly large chunks at a time. You probably want to break those chunks up into smaller pieces, into feature sets maybe, to model individually. You just do all the work that you would do in batches of an hour here or there every 2 weeks. You're going to have to do those batches all up front. And I have seen it done because obviously some of our clients are tied to hardware. So if you're building software, if you're building firmware, then you're very much tied to iteration cycles of hardware. So you have to do a lot of your thinking up front because once they've built the hardware, you can't just, oh wait, let's add this feature that requires something in the hardware to work. It just doesn't work that way. So there are still a lot of organizations that have to do waterfall. So yeah, break down your big story into manageable chunks so that you're not playing, well, you're not trying to play this game with all the things at once because you're going to only get so many of the threats out of all the threats that are possible. So break it down into smaller chunks, but do it up front before you start building.
Okay, awesome. Can you quickly go to the contact you slide again so that people know?
Yes.
So
How to get hold of me?
In case there
That's
are
me.
more questions. Cool. Grant, thank you very much for your talk.
My pleasure.
That is the last talk of this evening as far as the OWASP BeNeLux days are concerned. Tomorrow we will have 2 more talks. The first one will be at 7:30 Dutch time, that's GMT +1. 7:30 p.m. we will have Anastasia Vojtova, who will be talking about maintaining a cryptographic library in 12 languages, which is all manner of interesting. And after that, we will have Jeff Foley, who will talk to us about OWASP AMAS. We hope to see you tomorrow. Everybody who tuned in today, thank you very much for watching. Grant, once again, thank you very much for your talk. And we hope to see everybody tomorrow again. Bye-bye.
Heel erg bedankt, Cooper. En goedenavond allemaal.
Prepare for liftoff.